Hi, this is Deb Wenger. Today we're going to talk about digital mass media and specifically the internet, how the internet has become both a mass medium in its own right and how it's had a significant impact on the other mass media. So when you look at the internet and digital technology and digital media, you can't help but be struck by the amazing benefits that it provides to us. So we now have a way to communicate face-to-face all across the globe. I still remember the first time I used Skype when I was traveling in Europe to call back home. Less than a penny a minute to be able to talk halfway across the world. It's truly amazing. Search tools and social media help give us the answers to many questions, whether you're arguing with your pal and you can Google it and settle that argument instantaneously, or you're a journalist and you are on deadline and you need to know the population of Alabama. It's at your fingertips. Finding information has never been easier. And then finally, the tools that we now have that allow us to get this information regardless of where we are. You don't need to be at your desk with your office phone beside you. You don't have to drive down to the courthouse to pick up a copy of a deed. So much of this information is available via mobile devices and available digitally. It's a phenomenal time to be living as it relates to access to information. So it's important, I think, for us to understand a little bit about the way in which the internet works. So I'm going to simplify from your chapter. Hopefully I don't oversimplify for my web and internet experts out there, but I'm going to do my best to stay true to accuracy, but also kind of cut through some of the more complicated discussion you may have found in the text. So first, what is the internet? Well, the text defines it as a diverse set of independent networks interlinked to provide users with the appearance of a single uniform network. So essentially what we're saying is that the internet allows us to communicate with different types of computers on different types of networks without our ever being aware of those differences. So it has become a mass medium that incorporates elements of interpersonal, group, and mass communications. Let's take Facebook, for example. On Facebook, I'm having an interpersonal conversation by messaging a friend, but I may also be involved in group communication by posting a comment along with several other people on someone's post. And there's a potential that I'll be involved in mass communication. If something I post goes viral, I may reach people that I never intended to have see whatever it is that I'm posting. So how did this all develop? Well, let's start with a guy by the name of Paul Barron in 1964. He was trying to figure out, in case of a nuclear attack, how would we be able to continue to communicate military information. So he was working for the Air Force, and he figured out that if you could break up information into small digital data packets, that you could then send each of those packets independently across the network. And then a receiving computer could reassemble that message. So what that allowed him to do was bypass sort of a centralized server and be able to communicate computer to computer. So building on top of that, here's a diagram of how this works. You see here computer A essentially takes the information and breaks it down into smaller bits. And then that information travels across the network and is then reassembled by computer B. So computer A essentially breaks down the information, it travels over the network to computer B where it's reassembled. So this was the foundational idea behind the internet. ARPANET is a term that you will likely need to know or be glad that you know because it often gets referenced in any kind of discussion about the development of the internet. So Pentagon's Advanced Research Projects Agency built on top of Barron's idea because they wanted to make sure that incompatible computers all across the country could be communicating with each other. So, this allowed for much more flexibility in terms of getting information. It didn't have to be the same type of computer or on the same network. A computer in Phoenix could be communicating with a totally different type of computer in New York. This ARPANET went online in 1969, the same year as the moon landing. And again, we're still using the basic concepts that were developed by Barron and then refined in ARPANET. This led to a concept of multiple packet switching networks, which meant that there could be all kinds of data being transmitted without any interruption in the flow of information. Again, you see that most of this was developed by military because they realized how important communication would be in a time of war. So they answered the question, how do you link all these disparate networks together? And that's the foundational principle behind the internet. So with the internet's arrival, a few rules needed to be developed because you have all these different networks, all these different types of computers trying to communicate. It's going to be best if you can come up with some kind of cohesive way of transmitting information. So two guys, Bob Kahn and Vint Cerf, are credited with creating the rules for the ways in which networks communicate with each other. So TCP/IP, Transmission Control Protocol, Internet Protocol, essentially determines how data are transmitted and how computers can locate each other. So these protocols are used over and over again to allow the internet to work seamlessly. The term internet itself was developed by these guys, by Vint Cerf in particular, I believe, to mean an internetworking of networks. And of course, we've now shortened it to the word internet. Some of you may have heard of a guy named Tim Berners-Lee. So his concept took the internet and said, how can we use it? How can we take it beyond a military application? And he says that he was inspired by a book that he had in his family home called Inquire Within Upon Everything. So he wanted an ability for us to be able to inquire into computers to access any information that might be available there. So in his view, if he could come up with a system by which we could share documents on computers and it wouldn't matter where we were located anywhere in the world. So he developed this concept of the World Wide Web and gave away the software he created to make this work for free. And that's one of the foundational principles of the web, is that we're sharing information about how to make this work best. So his system relied on a few major components. So first is that there would be a uniform address for any content that exists on the web. So you've heard the term URL, Uniform Resource Locator. So that's that web address, www.advancingthestory.com is my website's web address. That's the URL. In addition, so you needed a standard set of rules for sending web content over the internet. And so that's what that HTTP is, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And then we need a language that will allow us to create content that can be viewed regardless of what kind of device is being used to access it. So that's HTML. It's basically a language that describes the content on web pages and tells it how to display in your browser. So there's a feeling that HTML is as important in this day and age as having foreign language instruction. And I would say certainly if you're going into any kind of communications field, getting a basic understanding of HTML is going to be invaluable to you. I know for me, I know enough so that I can go on my website, advancingthestory.com, and I can change a tag and help it display in a way that I find more appealing. If I've got a header that doesn't look right, I know enough to be able to go in and make adjustments. So having that kind of sort of cursory understanding of HTML has been really invaluable to me. And the more that you know about it, I think the more useful it will be for you in your career, again, particularly if you're going into a communications field. So what are some of the key principles of the web that certainly Berners-Lee and others embrace? One is that really there should just be one address that would take users to any document or website on the web. And so, it doesn't matter where you're located, it doesn't matter what kind of device you're using, the URL will take you to the same place. Everything should be accessible or linkable. So if you're going to put content on the web, there should be a way for you to allow people access to it, or to make it easy for people to get from one place to another on the web. Any type of data should be available on any type of computer. So this goes back to sort of those rules for, regardless of device, how do I get my information on the web in a way that's going to make it accessible to others. The web should be a tool for interaction, not just publication. So we've certainly been taking much more advantage of this in recent years than back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, right? So social media is probably our best example of how the web has become a tool for interaction, not just a way to send out information. And this idea of no central control. So this key principle of the web is at the heart of a controversy that exists right now and that's unfolding and has been unfolding for the past several years. So a concept called net neutrality. So net neutrality says that internet service providers, so the companies that essentially bring that internet access to you, whether that's through your phone service or through a cable modem, that they need to treat all data on the internet equally. So not say that I could pay a little bit more and have Advancing the Story more accessible than my friend's website that's on a similar topic. And that you're not discriminating or charging people differently based on users. So we need to be able to say that regardless of how you access it, what you access, who you are, that you will have the same type of service is at the heart of the net neutrality debate. Just recently, on February 26th, the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, ruled that the internet should be treated like any other utility. So why is this important? Well, you may or may not know that if something is a public utility, it's subject to federal regulations designed for the most part to protect the consumer. So the power company, for example, can't just turn off your power willy-nilly. They have to notify you, even if you haven't paid your bill for a couple of months. You have to be notified. There's a grace period. There are programs designed to prevent your power from being shut off if you don't have the money to pay for it. So all of these sort of safeguards are in place because we realize that you can't really live without power. So this is kind of an acknowledgement of how important the internet is in our lives. So if you look at this debate, what you'll see on one side, the people that oppose the idea of ruling that the net needs to be similar to a utility are companies like AT&T, Verizon, or Comcast. The companies that support this ruling are companies like Google, Facebook, WordPress. So you notice on the one hand we have the service providers, on the other hand we have the people that are serving up content. So this is an issue, as I said, that's been talked about for at least a decade. I would imagine that we will be continuing to hear issues related to net neutrality in the news. It's become a very political issue, and it's one that's really important to us as consumers of digital information. And I would highly encourage you to educate yourself, come up with your own view on this, and continue to follow this issue, because it's one that a lot of people aren't very familiar with, but it's one that will affect us in ways that we probably can't even imagine at this moment. So when it comes to accessing the web, it's a very different picture depending on where you live in the world. So this map actually, I believe, was captured in 2012, and it shows, as you can see, better than 80% penetration in terms of people's access to the web in the US, in parts of Europe, in Australia. But that light blue is less than 20% of the population with access to the internet in Africa, in some parts of Asia. And so there really is a digital divide globally, and there's a digital divide in the US as well. You certainly have pockets of the US where access to the web is much more limited than how it might appear on this map. So how are people accessing the web? Well, high-speed broadband has been growing, although its rate of growth has slowed a little bit because of the expansion of wireless and satellite access to the internet. So mobile phones have become a major boon in terms of reducing the digital divide, especially here in the US, where so many people do have mobile phones which do allow them to get online without any kind of broadband or other forms of hardwire infrastructure. So this is a really interesting snapshot of digital access and what people are doing with digital access. You see that the world population, over 7 billion. About a third of those folks, a little more than a third, do use the internet on an ongoing basis. They're considered active internet users. Of course, one of the things that is having a major impact on the way we create and consume information is social media. Much of that active social media use happens on mobile devices. 1.56 billion considered to be active mobile social users. So it is a highly digital world. So digital news is worth an entire lecture on its own, but we're going to hit the highlights here today. Obviously, in terms of digital news, CNN, USA Today, New York Times, your local TV station, all online now, and all providing apps or mobile versions of their websites. So everybody realizes that they have to be in the digital information game. They have to provide information in a digital format because that's where the growth in audience is located. And we're also seeing a bunch of new players coming on the scene. Vice, BuzzFeed, Bleacher Report, Huffington Post, Politico. These are all companies that exist as digital platforms only. And they're all making strides in terms of hiring people. More and more, the new jobs that are being created in the area of journalism are related to digital news sites. And then, of course, you also have the aggregator sites of Google, Yahoo, Bing. So these sites that essentially capture information being produced, already available digitally, and then try to make sense of that information around certain topics, around topics that are getting a lot of internet traffic. And of course, digital news also includes things like Wikipedia, blogs, social media. I know now when I hear of someone who has died, a celebrity or famous politician or someone that I think is likely to have a Wikipedia page, I often go there first when I learn of a death or I learn of a significant development. When Robin Williams died, I went to Wikipedia because I often want just a really straightforward background material on the person before I end up going to read the news stories that have been written about him or her. So, how are people around the world accessing news? Interestingly, you'll notice in the US, about 50% of people still watching television. Television continues to be a dominant source of news and information in the US. Much less news accessed on radio, only about 4%. Print is down to 6% in terms of most valued platform. So people were asked not just where they go, but what platform do they value the most. And then note that online is at about 35%. So that is the only one of these sources that continues to grow. And if you break this down by demographic, you'll see that those who prefer television tend to be much older than those who prefer online. So journalism is definitely changing. One of our graduates, a young man by the name of Tony Russell, working at an Oklahoma television station, tells me today he carries 2 phones with him so that he can do all of the work that he needs to do in social media and on the web and stay in contact with sources. He says he uses Instagram to show what he's working on and what's going on behind the scenes while he's producing his regular story for the newscast. To quote him, he says Twitter is his breaking news machine. So that's where he learns about what's happening on stories that he may be covering, and that's where he adds to the conversation with information he's learning about the stories he's working on. He uses an app called Ustream to stream video, and you can check out some of his work on all of these platforms by checking out at Tony Russell TV. So at the same time that the internet has made a journalist's job easier in terms of access to communication, in terms of speed of communication, you talk about the apps here that Tony uses to communicate with his audience. The addition of the interactivity, the addition of the platforms that he has to publish on have made the job of a journalist, of a multimedia journalist, much more challenging. Still exciting, still an amazing profession to have, but also an amazing amount of work. And as one of my friends puts it, so many opportunities to be wrong. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to our ethics and law chapter. But suffice it to say that the internet has radically changed the job of a journalist regardless of the platform that he or she works on. So digital media essentially brings together traditional legacy media with online media. So we still have the traditional newspaper players, television players, radio players, but they're now communicating in a digital environment and adding to their toolkit. Sometimes that can lead to something called reverse synergy, when you get the worst of both by combining old and new. And I think privacy issues related to the internet and the web are examples of this. It's wonderful to get information suggested to me based on the preferences that I've shown in the past on various websites. But it's also a little frightening to think about how much data is being collected about me every time I visit a news site. There's a major and significant change taking place. I think it's particularly important to anybody studying integrated marketing communications or any type of PR or marketing, and that is that media outlets are trying to become brands. So the question your textbook poses is the New York Times a newspaper or is it a brand of news? Most people will tell you that it's going to be the brands that survive, not the medium-specific outlets. So as always, be sure to tweet information that you see out there, stories that you think are particularly relevant to our discussions. Hashtag UMJOUR101. Look forward to seeing what you might have to say about the internet and how it's affecting us, whether that's social media, whether it's traditional media appearing. And don't forget, as always, to take the quiz. You'll need to do that by Friday at 5 p.m.